Hello, good afternoon. My name is Aidan Chaffin, and my project is called Mirror with a Memory, Cinema of the Shapeshifter. This project was an exposition, my very own exposition on film theory through the lens of the shapeshifter subgenre and based on the work of German film theorist Siegfried Kracauer, whom I will go into in a little bit. But first, I'd like to just talk about some movies. So The Thing is a 1982 film directed by John Carpenter about a team of researchers in Antarctica whose base is attacked by an alien that can take the form of its victims. Annihilation is a 2018 film directed by Alex Garland about a group of female scientists who investigate a lighthouse and its surrounding area called the Shimmer after a meteor strike. And what they find is that the people who have been emerging from the Shimmer are not the same people who entered. It Follows is a 2014 film directed by David Robert Mitchell about a girl who is pursued by a shape-shifting monster that begins to follow her after a sexual encounter. And finally, Invasions of the Body Snatchers is a 1956 film by Don Siegel about an alien invasion and where the aliens are replacing citizens of a small California town with unfeeling doppelgangers. So as you may have noticed, the shapeshifter subgenre often deals with either an alien or a monster invasion. They sort of fall into the subcategory of thriller cinema, or specifically doppelganger thriller cinema. Thus, the shapeshifter itself represents this return of the repressed. It symbolizes the unconscious mind, the uncanny part of ourselves that is simultaneously both completely familiar and utterly unknowable. The alien itself literally represents pieces of our identity that we run from or hide away from others. Thus, the alien's most dangerous weapon is its ability to turn our closest allies into enemies, and why each of the protagonists in these stories struggle to distinguish themselves from their imposters. So now I want to get back to a little bit of what my project focused on, which was the work of Siegfried Kracauer. He discusses this ideal of realism and fantasy and its beginnings within film history. This conversation has been taking place really since the advent of film technology and discussions about whether film had potential to be an artistic medium or if it was better suited for scientific research, documentary purposes. People weren't really on board with it being considered art the same way painting or drawing would be, specifically because photography and film are what we call automatisms, or basically the image is produced by a mechanism, not necessarily by human construction. And so Kracauer really contextualizes this division within film theory by juxtaposing the Lumiere brothers versus Georges Méliès. These are all French filmmakers, and in fact, the Lumiere brothers are credited as the original filmmakers. What they did mostly was take little 1 to 2 minute short films, snapshots of everyday French life, such as garden work or trains. And these were very popular. These were very exciting. It was a new technology being shown. However, once after a couple years, I guess, the excitement really died out and audiences were looking for something a little more interesting. So we get someone like Georges Méliès, who has a background in magic and illusion, and he sees film as really this medium where he can use editing and manipulation and image manipulation to create this fantastical narratives or fiction. So we have films like Trip to the Moon and Impossible Voyage in the early 1900s. Now, Kracauer was writing in the 1960s, and where the realism fantasy dialogue was very much still alive. And we even have evidence that it is still ongoing today with the advent of digital cinema and CGI special effects, these computer generated effects within cinema that are really challenging our notion of realism, authenticity, and film theory as a whole. So more specifically on Kracauer himself, Kracauer was a diehard realist, really believed that realism was the highest cinematic virtue that film could have. He believed that the camera was like a mirror with a memory, and in that it captured whatever was placed before it, and it was the filmmaker's job to really use the camera to replicate the experience of being out in nature these sentiments are really sort of born out of his perspective being in 1960s Germany, post-World War II, where fascism and fantasy and propaganda kind of all went hand in hand, and realism was a tool that he sought to combat that and to sort of correct the public's relationship with film. Thus, realism and authenticity were things to strive for. So he does talk about the ways that film is inevitably going to distort reality, or the act of filming is a perversion of reality. He talks, of course, about the compression of a 3D space onto a 2D plane. He talks about the imposition of color technology, whereas black and white was seen as more natural for the time. And most importantly, I want to hit on this note most, this natural essence that seemingly can't really be captured by the camera. I'm sure we all maybe have a sense of what this means, but he does offer this really interesting thought experiment that I thought I'd share. He suggests if we were to go into a studio and recreate all the like the lighting, the scenery, the visuals of being on the top of Mont Blanc, which is the highest peak in Europe, and we were to take a photo of that, and then if we were to climb the mountain ourselves actually and take a photo on the summit, and if you were to show anybody these two photos side by side, they would be able to tell the difference between the authentic Mont Blanc photo and the studio mimic. And the idea was that this nature has this essence or this soul that can't really be translated into film. Mont Blanc itself is really charged with these romantic narratives. And so it's a good example of what could be lost by a photograph that you won't get from actually sitting face to face with somebody. So this sort of leads into my own theory about using these shapeshifter narratives that I mentioned in the beginning of the presentation as a metaphor, or at least the monster as a metaphor for film itself. Both the creature and film are in some ways doubling media in that they have a need and desire to consume and copy their victims in order to constitute existence. Film itself cannot exist without something being placed in front of it and having that being captured. Same thing with the shapeshifter. If the shapeshifter were to exist in its natural alien form, it would expose itself and its evil intentions. Thus, it needs to copy what is closest to it in order to blend in. Another interesting feature was this exclusive communication through monologue. A lot of the shapeshifters in these films either don't talk at all, or if they do talk, are unable to promote dialogue or have any interest in human rationale. They are kind of coming in with their own agenda and nothing's going to sway them. And this reminded me of our own relationship with film. We can watch film, we can digest film, but there's no opportunity for dialogue present. So another interesting piece was this inability to replicate or translate the true essence of a person that I sort of alluded to earlier. The shapeshifter inevitably is exposed at the end of these films, or throughout the film. There's always this challenge to sort of identify it as a copy, which comprises most of the conflict throughout these films. And finally, this was an interesting question that my mentor and I really struggled with was if we're going to be using the shapeshifter as a metaphor for film, we cannot ignore the fact that the shapeshifter is a perversion of the familiar. It will take your friends, your family, your loved ones, and replicate them and then try to kill you. So there is this sort of reversal of intention, this total corruption. And I was wondering if this extended into our film as shapeshifter metaphor, if there was a similar, I guess, aspect to film or preserving our own image that could be seen as corruptive. So this got us to the question of what there is. The idea of self-preservation, fame, and image obsession is not unfamiliar to literature and film today. We have literary examples like Picture of Dorian Gray, and classical and contemporary film examples such as Sunset Boulevard and Birdman. All of these characters become obsessed with preserving their either youth, beauty, career, all these things that are fleeting, and they engage in this losing battle trying to preserve it through the preservation of an image. This draws each of them into this delusionary state, and each of them suffers this sort of fate of Narcissus, where it is their own obsession with themselves that leads to their downfall. Some of them even committing suicide. So there really is this sort of dialogue or narrative of the self-destructive aspects of image obsession and self-preservation that can happen through film. So I challenge everyone in the audience to sort of grapple with this and how this might sort of appear in our own lives. The younger generation might say that this could remind us of our relationship with social media and the internet and living in an image-focused culture these days, and the potential negative and adverse side effects that sort of come with that. So thank you. I'm happy to take any questions. Here.